sorry. Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and start. Happy November, mid-November. All right, so we are excited to continue presentations by our wonderful postdoctoral fellows. Today we have Carlos Schmidt-Padilla, who has a PhD from Berkeley. He was a research associate at the Center on the Politics of Development. He is now a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Impact Labs, and he's associated with the Poverty, Violence, and Governance Lab here at CVDRL. He works on the political economy of development in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and studies questions around crime, human capital, immigration, and policing. He will be presenting today his research on gangs and extortion in El Salvador. If you have any questions on the Zoom, please enter them into the Q&A, and we look forward to your talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Didi, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Can you click on? Oh, there you go. Okay, awesome. So today I'm going to be presenting joint work with Zach Brown in Michigan, Eduardo Montero, Chicago, and Maria Micaela Sviaccia at Princeton that seeks to understand the political economy of extortion with a focus on El Salvador. In developing countries where the rule of law is often weak, organized crime and associated extortion is a common topic in daily life. For example, in El Salvador, extortion is the main revenue source for gangs. It is estimated that around 70% of businesses pay extortion. Despite this, we know very little about extortion, the political economy of it, and like the importance of gang competition to see how it affects it. And also what are the kind of like the welfare implications of this for consumers. So one of the things we're going to argue in this paper is like understanding gang competition is particularly important to understanding extortion. Governments often facilitate cooperation between criminal organizations. And also enforcement might also kind of affect the extortion function of gangs. Why is extortion so difficult to study? Mainly because it's a measuring problem. Gang extortion is very difficult to measure systematically. It is rarely observed and reported to the police out of fear of retaliation from the gangs. And despite 70% of businesses in El Salvador reporting extortion, very little bit actually gets reported to the police, right? This means that we lack understanding of extortion. So in this paper, what we're going to try to do is answer three main questions. First, how do gangs determine extortion rates? How does gang competition matter for extortion? And what are the downstream effects of extortion on the population? How are we going to do this? We're going to leverage data from a leading wholesale distribution company in El Salvador. We have detailed sales data with revenue and cost for each product and retailer in the country. We have the location and payment of over 50,000 extortion payments. This is a distribution company, so the gangs require the trucks to stop at select locations and they have to pay extortion to individuals. And this map here, you can see one day, so this will sort of be just one day, not the whole period, of it, like the extortion distribution in El Salvador, with the blue dots being deliveries without extortion and the red dots being deliveries with extortion. It's actually all over the country. This is again just one day and then delivery. And for identification, we're going to leverage the 2016 Non-Aggression Pact between gangs in El Salvador that drastically reduced competition and also violence. So here you can see like the evolution of monthly homicides in the country. You have the 2012 truce between gangs that led to like around 40 to 50% drop in homicides. And similarly, you have the 2016 Non-Aggression Pact that led to also a drastic drop in violence. And we're going to ask, did the pact allow gangs to collude on extortion? Hopefully you guys are familiar with El Salvador, but if you're not, let me give you some background on the country. El Salvador usually makes the news as being one of the most violent peacetime countries in the world. In 2015, they had a murder rate of 103 per 100,000. That's more violent than a lot of wartime countries in that year. And this is largely due to two main gangs, MS-13 and 18th Street, also known as Barrio 18. Gang membership for these two gangs accounts for around 87% of all the gang membership in the country, and they're present in almost all of the 262 municipalities in the country. Estimates say that around 70,000 individuals are gang members, and roughly anywhere from 300,000 to 400,000 are close collaborators or family members that depend on the day-to-day for a country of 6.5 million. So it's a relatively high percentage of the population. And much of the violence of these two gangs can be traced back to extortion. Extortion is kind of like the economic engine behind gangs, is the main revenue source. And gangs fight for territory so they can extort firms, just like the distribution company we're going to be analyzing in this paper. And also gangs rely on violence to kind of be able to collect extortion. Transportation and distribution firms are often a target for extortion because they're present in all the territory in the country. So they go to all the municipalities, most of the neighborhoods, but they're usually a very prime target for the gangs. And gangs usually require trucks to pay extortion in order to deliver or enter to an area. And combating crime has been kind of like the #1 kind of policy issue for the Salvadoran government. And they kind of oscillate between very brutal repression and also to like instances where they facilitate negotiations and collaboration. And this is 2 images of actually the accounting of extortion by gangs. So in Panama, you have this gang member called Dimo and Danger, and how much they're collecting from different firms. Sorry. And similar here, you have like Tienda. So TND is Tienda, which is like a store. And this is how much they're collecting from each of those stores on a monthly basis. So this is in July of 2017. So you know this small shop is usually like a mom and pop shop is paying around $100 twice a month in extortion to this client. That being said, transportation distribution firms tended to be like the main source of revenue for gangs in terms of extortion because they're so mobile and they go all over the country. Mutually, gangs require trucks to pay extortion in order to be able to deliver to an area. There's like a right to deliver, not a right to pass through. So don't think about this as a toll, but rather like a right to like stop in a particular area that's controlled by the gangs and be able to make a delivery to your retailers. Usually gangs only pay to one gang to make a delivery because gangs have like a very predefined, in other research we looked at the predefined territories in the country.
So how is it not a toll?
So
you said you want to distinguish between it being a toll and something else.
Yeah, so if you're just passing by a territory, you're not going to be making any stops. You're not going to be interacting with the gangs.
I see.
But if you're going to be stopping and like kind of like interacting with individuals or shops in their territory, that's where like you have to pay extortion.
And why you have the point, distributors in general cannot stop delivering to a location.
So that's just like it will hurt the bottom line. I mean, El Salvador is a relatively small country with 262 municipalities. So if you stop delivering, you're going to be hitting your bottom line. And we actually show some analysis.
So you know that given that we're like asking a lot of like clarification questions, can you like so like you had this like example of like I think $200 per month or so. How much is this like compared to like income? It seems like a lot of money now.
Yeah, so I mean I don't have any like information about like firm earnings, but like the average salary in El Salvador for an urban worker is around $200.
How much?
$300. So, you know, this is something like pretty much the shop has to be taking up from the bottom line as well. Thanks. And obviously, like the failure to pay extortion can be dire. In this slide, you can see a news clip where a bread delivery truck was burned down because of failure to pay extortion. So at the same time, you have a very violent context, but you also have this period where there's actually peace, because the gang kind of try to negotiate, kind of like try to calm the situation. The most famous example that was very noteworthy in the international press was a 2012 gang truce that was brokered by the government. The left-wing government kind of sat down with both MS-13 and Barrio Extortion to kind of negotiate a truce, and that led to a drop around 40 to 50% in homicides. A lesser known instance of gang cooperation is the April 2016 non-aggression pact between the two gangs. So where the gangs agreed to not fight one another and respect existing territory. Okay. And obviously, like I showed before, this drastically reduced gang violence. So here in the 2012 truce, you see a decrease around 40 to 50% in gang homicides, and also similarly around the 2016 non-aggression pact. And crucially, like unfortunately for us, the extortion data we have goes back to 2012, so we don't have a pre-period. So we only focus on the 2016 non-aggression pact. So before going to data, does anyone need any more clarifying questions?
So just can you tell us again, maybe a little more slowly, where you get the data from? Is that from the police? Is that from the distribution companies? I think you mentioned.
Yeah. So the homicide data comes from the police. So it comes both from the coroner's office. There's 3 agencies that collect homicide data: the coroner's office, the police, and the attorney general's office. So we corroborate it we triangulate it between the 3 agencies. And I'm going to talk about the extortion data.
Okay.
Just right now.
Okay.
Any other clarifying questions?
So a clarifying question from Steve Prasser online, who's
Sure.
asking how many bribes are paid to the government or how this compares to bribes that might be paid to local government officials.
Yeah, so maybe I can hold off until the end, because like usually when we think about this, we think about the old 2009 paper, like the bribe and extortion in Ake. So we can talk about that.
Great.
So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the data we're going to be using. So we use extortion payment data and sales data from a leading wholesale distribution company in El Salvador from 2012 to 2019. We obviously don't name the firm because we have an NDA with them and they're the ones they gratefully provided the information. They're major supplier of both consumer goods and pharmaceuticals. They usually buy goods from abroad and then resell them to local retailers. Okay. For the distribution, the company subcontracts drivers and trucks, and the trucks usually leave a central depot in the San Salvador metropolitan area, and they return at the end of the day. El Salvador is a relatively small country. You can go from west to east in around 4 hours. Over the sample period, we have 93,000 delivery trips and 2.2 million deliveries to retailers. Okay, so a really rich data set. In terms of the response to extortion, obviously this evolved over time, but over the period, this is pretty constant. They have a robust security team that is led by a very charismatic, a little bit eccentric ex-police officer. It's a very common approach in El Salvador. In terms of the mechanics of the extortion payment, so when you're approaching gang territory, the driver will stop. There will be a collaborator or gang member that will approach the driver. They call the security team. They confirm that how much they have to pay. They also confirm that the driver hands the gang member or collaborator the extortion amount for that trip. Okay.
So the driver doesn't negotiate it, the security guy.
Yeah, the security guy is the one that does it.
And it's always this eccentric police.
They have a team of around 6-7 people.
Yes.
In some cases, the extortion amount is pre-negotiated for a given period, usually bi-weekly or weekly, but this can vary. It's actually comical and also relatively sad, but around Christmas and Easter, gangs in El Salvador, by law, you have to be, if you're in the formal sector, you get a bonus. So the gangs also ask for a bonus around Christmas and Easter. And the security team emphasizes that this system, kind of always calling this central office, reduces fraud, and also make sure the gang actually receives the payment, because if not, that can lead to dire consequences, like the drivers getting targeted by the gangs, as we saw with the bread delivery truck. And really importantly, they ask us to emphasize this, is that all their extortion payments are reported to the Attorney General's office, because in El Salvador, paying extortion is considered terrorist financing, because gangs are considered terrorist organizations by a 2015 Supreme Court decision. So here you see the geography of extortion in the country over the whole sample period. So we have around 51,000 extortion payments between March of 2012 and March of 2019. There's a concentration here in the San Salvador metropolitan area, also with some extortion payments in other urban centers in the west and east of the country. There's large variation in extortion payments. The individual extortion payments, so the extortion payments you're paying, each instance, vary from 50 cents to up to $140 with a mean of 7. And if you do that, if you aggregate that at the municipality level, the average extortion payment in a municipality ranges from 2 to 60, again with a mean of 7. The average truck pays around $14 per route in a day. And that's equal to half of the salary of the driver. So it's not it's not a trivial amount, it's actually relatively large. So we're going to combine the extortions data with the sales data using information on the route, truck, and location to examine the correlates of extortion. We're going to focus on the near sale. What does this mean? So this means you're approaching territory, you have the extortion payment, and you have the near sale, the one that's right after the extortion payment. So it's going to be the focus of our analysis. So we're going to analyze this again using the 2016 unrushed back. Again, we don't use the 2012 truths because we don't have a pre-period prior to that. And we're going to exploit 2 sources of variation. First, the unexpected timing of the 2016 non-aggression pact, and also the cross-sectional variation in gang competition prior to the pact. Putting standard difference and difference, where we have non-aggression is 1 if it's after the April 2016 pact, and comp D is kind of a measure of competition that equals 1 if we have gang competition prior to the pact. We include municipal and time fixed effects, and the paper will also perform another set of robust tests like this.
So the non-aggression pact, just to be clear, it was just between those 2 gangs, because you said 13% of membership.
Yes.
was from, so that comp D variable, would that include competition from the other 13%?
So we're actually defining this in the next slide. Police reports usually contain detailed information on all homicides. There is not perfect data, but it's the best data we have. And usually police determine gang responsible for each homicide, whether you're a victim or the perpetrator, based on like the twos of the corpse they find, the territory where it is, and like the known gang activity in the area, etc. So when both gangs, or just the two gangs, are competing, both gangs commit homicides in area, gangs are competing, and we construct a Hirschman-Herfindahl index using the share of homicides committed by the two gangs 3 years prior to the fact. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, so we don't include the other minor gangs because there's just so many of them, and they really like vary just in one neighborhood in the country. So the other larger ones like Mau Mau, so the third largest one, but it's just very minimal presence in the country. Like these two are like the ones that are actually just competing amongst themselves, between themselves, sorry. For baseline specification, comp D is equal to 0 if the HAI is in the top quartile. So when you calculate an HAI, 1 signifies monopoly. So the closer to 0 means we have more competition, and one otherwise we're using the bottom 75% of municipalities have competition. But in the paper, we show robustness to alternate cutoffs, also continuous measures of extortion of this, and we also show this correlates with other measures of competition. In the paper, we actually also construct this using inmate data. So we have all the individuals that entered the prison system since 1980, and we have like where they reside. So we also use that as a measure of competition, and the results hold. Well, the results I'm going to show you next. Okay. Here in panel A, you have yearly homicides. Again, the most murderous municipality, the capital is in Salvador, but actually even the light areas is 50 homicides a year, so it's still relatively large. And then here you have kind of like the distribution of the HAI across the country. Okay. Any question? Next, we're going to talk about like just validating or measure of competition. So we're going to compare areas that had competition prior to the pact with area with low to no competition prior to the pact, and we see like the largest drop in homicides is coming from the black areas versus the gray areas. Because again, that's because that's where gangs kind of decided to kind of call it a piece for the period. When we do this in table and regression form in the paper, we show this actually led to a 25% reduction in homicides. And we also test whether this affected other types of crime like robberies, thefts, sexual assault, battery, etc. And we actually don't see any changes in those crimes. The only changes we're seeing is in homicides. Next, we're going to look at the effects on extortion. So this is at the extortion payment level. So we're seeing how much does the extortion value change in the period. And we see like the non-aggression pact leads to a 90% increase in extortion, in the value of extortion. All right, so when gangs call it quits, they're kind of divert their resources from making war to now collecting more extortion. This is the value of the extortion, not necessarily the incidence of extortion, which we'll look at next. This is an MS study of that. So again, it's pretty flat in the pre-period, and then you see as you go more into the non-aggression pact, there's actually the increase in extortion. Next, we're looking at the extensive margin. So the number of extortion payments that you're making in a route municipality. So within the same route, we look at how many times you pay extortion within one municipality. And we have some indication that a non-aggression pact leads to a doubling of extortion incidents. But again, this is not robust to all of our different fixed effects and control variables. And if we estimate this as a probability, which is not shown, the coefficients are positive and not significant. So what we're seeing is like, we're not seeing like extortion behavior change. What we're actually seeing is like the amount of extortion that you're getting charged for each incident actually increasing, not necessarily the number of extortion increasing.
Do you have an explanation for why that is?
Yeah, so I mean, like the firm is not changing behavior in this period, and we show that next. But what we're seeing is just like you actually give me like 4 slides.
Sure, no problem.
And I think I'll be able to answer that. Then we look at the aggregate effects. So here what we do is like the route municipality. So how much are in a route are you paying in a municipality? We look at how much extortion is increasing. And we find around a 10% increase in extortion. So again, this is kind of like a combination of both the intensive and extensive margin results. So here we go to your question. So we're going to try to answer why is this happening? And we have both qualitative and also empirical evidence of this economies of scope. And this just means that gangs are inefficient at waging war and also collecting extortion. So when you start waging war, you can now dedicate more time to collecting extortion, right? So we find empirical evidence that supports this. First, we look at more resources to extortion. And usually threats are really important for like an extortion, right? If you go out to someone and you say like, if you don't give me $10, I'm gonna kill you. So we find that that's actually increasing just for gang members. And we also find that the delivery times actually increase. So that possibly the negotiation between the security team and the gang members increase right after the non-rush effect. So I'm not showing you delivery times in this presentation, but let me show you the one about gang threats. So we have the number of arrests. In El Salvador, the majority of arrests happen in flagrante. So that means within 48 hours of the crime being committed, because police is relatively inefficient. So you see that gang-related arrests are the ones that increase versus non-gang related in the post period. And if you don't believe,
Sorry, so what's the interpretation?
so the more gang members are kind of like out and about, kind of threatening people to collect extortion. Yeah. And if you don't believe that threats are important for extortion, consider the following kind of police account of an extortion event from a sentencing that happened. So this victim was asked to deliver $75 to the gang members. Otherwise, they would receive the children body bags. They shouldn't dare report it to the police, because if not, they would also be bagged like their children. And they emphasized they knew where the victim worked, where the children studied, and they also listed all the information of the relatives. So gangs invested the extra time they have now to kind of better target the individuals who are extorted. Okay, sorry, it's a little bit wordy. At the same time, we also kind of rule out other potential alternate explanations. So one thing we're interested in is like, there's a decrease in violence, there might be more economic activity, people might be expending more, but we actually rule out downstream demand. So people are not changing their consumption patterns, their incomes are not changing in the period, et cetera. And also the firms is still delivering the same amount as before. Actually, I'll show you that in some other slides. So just to summarize this kind of first set of results, the results show that gang collusion increases extortion rates, right? And we find that this is suggestive evidence that is driven by a shift in resources towards extortion, as measured by threats and also the delivery times. And in the paper, we do multiple extensions again with alternate HAI cutoffs using continuous treatment for the HAI, and we also do a canton level analysis. In El Salvador, cantons are the level right below municipalities, and the results are pretty much indistinguishable from what I just showed you. And we also use the inmate HHI measure that I mentioned earlier. So next, okay, so extortion is increasing 19% at the payment level and 10% at the aggregate level. Why should we care about this? So that's what we try to do when we answer this question. What are the downstream consequences of extortion? Here we're going to use two approaches. So we have two data sets. So we have the distributor sales data, right? We have large variety in both consumer goods, a link to the individual extortion payments. One of the negatives about this is we only observe in the margin for the distributor, right? Rather than the actual prices people pay. There's only one firm. It's a relatively large firm, but it's still only one firm. But at the same time, I was also able to get us access to pharmacy sales data in the country. So we observe the final consumer prices people are paying, and also health outcomes for individuals. And here's multiple firms, so pretty much all the pharmacies in the country. However, this is only for pharmaceutical goods. Okay. So first, we're going to analyze the first set of data, the distribution sales data. So again, we're observing the distributor's margin. So here, consider this as the difference between revenue and procurement. So this kind of includes profit, delivery cost, and the extortion. Okay. From the perspective of the retailer, think about this as a delivery fee distribution company started. Okay, so just like before, we're going to use a difference in difference, and also an instrumental variables, difference in difference. And we see that collusion leads to a 12% increase in the distributor margins. So like the distributor is charging more to the individuals nearest to the extortion payment. Okay, and then when we look at this in the instrumental variables approach, for each dollar, for each additional dollar of the extortion amount, 0.83 cents. The distributor charges 0.83 cents more to the retailer. So pretty much it's almost a perfect pass through. It's at 80%, but still pretty large. Okay. Then we look at this heterogeneity, like between types of goods, and we see no difference. For the only exception being for staple foods. So like staple foods are the ones that are most reacting to this. So the ones that are becoming more expensive. And this is kind of key to like previous comments when you mentioned. So here, this is kind of one of the limitations about the paper is we're documenting extortion to transportation firms. Firms that are mobile, right? They have the option of an exit. Whereas a mom and pop shop, like the ones that you saw earlier in the gang notebooks, they don't have the option of exit, right? You pay or you die. This firm, like you can stop delivering to a particular neighborhood. But what we actually see is like they don't, right? And part of the reason in conversations with them is because they don't want to hurt their bottom line. They also have existing contractual relationships with his customers. Okay, so there's no change in the number of deliveries. And we actually look at the total cost of the goods being delivered, the total deliveries being done, unique products being delivered, and also the unique retailers you're delivering to. And we see is pretty much no change in the pre and post period, right? So the only thing that's changing is kind of like the extortion.
Could it also be that the gangs want to make sure that the delivery is still coming through? That part of the reason why they don't deliver isn't just their bottom line, but because they feel pressure to continue delivering.
Like
Like if they don't, they might get killed too, because you're not paying your extortions, you're not coming into our territory. We need that revenue. No, there's no threats like that.
I would think a little bit more about that, but I could imagine a scenario in which, you know, like the gang might be willing to negotiate a little bit more with you, just so you keep coming in, because they want that kind of like regular flow.
And given that there's two gangs and they cover almost all of the country,
Yeah.
you can't like not go to one gang area and go to
Yeah.
another one, and you know. So I just wondered how much of this is driven by threats from the gang, not so much the bottom line profit.
I mean, so one time I got upgraded to business class on a flight, and I was actually talking to they delivered the L'Oreal products in the country, and they actually exited from a lot of the neighborhoods because the extortion was hurting the bottom line too much.
I see.
And I also thought that were morally wrong, that they were paying extortion.
Right.
So I think it depends on the company.
Yeah, so just like following up on this, I think like obviously, you know, as a gang, you want to like keep this like constant like stream of revenue, but like to what extent do these gangs like see themselves responsible for like delivering goods for the communities? Like, you know, if like they basically pretend these firms are entering and delivering like basic goods, that would probably like hurt the gangs as well, no?
Yeah, so I think when you compare this to like, for example, like Mexican cartels or like Colombian drug trafficking organizations, I think that's one key difference.
Okay.
It's like those DTOs are actually providing public goods. There's like, you know, this whole literature that talks about criminal governance. Professor Magaloni being one of like the prominents of that. Salvadoran gangs are pretty much just purely extractive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's like this, I mean, there's definitely like, you know, they have a large networks, right, that benefit from all the illicit activities, but they're pretty extractive.
Okay.
And we have survey evidence to that in other works we've done. So lastly, I just might show you the effects on pharmacy prices. So again, we're only observing for pharmacies in the country. And this is really important because El Salvador has among the highest drug prices in Central America. And this potentially reduces the access to drugs and also affects health. It's actually, for some drugs, it's actually more expensive than the US. In the US, it's already pretty inaccessible. The data is provided by the National Directorate of Medicines in El Salvador and covers 2014 to 2017. So it contains information on the quantity and revenue by pharmacy for over 10,000 products that we observe at the molecule brand size. So again, pretty granular data. I'm going to standardize this. And then we can see like the gang collusions, again, this is the same specifications as before. gang collusion results in an 8% increase in retail price for pharmacies. And we see a similar behavior for the ones that are for managing chronic diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular problems, etc. This is particularly like worrying because El Salvador has double the average of like diabetes, for example, is 9% of the population. So this makes drug prices more inaccessible in the country. So then we analyze this on the effects on health, right? So how do we do this? So we do this using hospital admissions data from 2012 to 2019 that we draw from the Ministry of Health and the Salvadoran Social Security Institute. The only difference is that the Salvadoran Social Security Institute covers formal workers and the Ministry of Health covers just everyone else. El Salvador in theory has universal health access, but the Ministry of Health is not the best provider. But at the same time, so we're observing around 95% of the country because only 5% has access to private health insurance. So this contains the information about the hospital, municipality of residence of the individual being admitted, admission states, age and gender, and also a classification of the disease. So we see there's no general increase in hospital admissions, even for injuries, right? We look at injuries because that's associated with violence in the country, but we do see an increase in hospitalizations for drugs that have drug adherence for chronic diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular problems, etc. Okay, and briefly, just to conclude, so in countries with high levels of organized crime, governments have often facilitated cooperation between them in order to reduce violence. However, we need to, when we think about this, we always obviously observing the reduction in violence, but we're also not thinking about the externalities that this might bring about. So here we document kind of like the increase in extortion prices, and also this has downstream effects, both for consumers and also eventually for health outcomes in the country. And also this kind of provides some insights into the economies of gang, kind of like the price discrimination that goes on, and also how violence is closely connected, kind of like the economic incentives of them. And kind of like the market structure that the gangs kind of pretty much develop may be important for designing anti-extortion policies. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
All right, Marcel, go ahead.
When you started this facility presentation, it immediately reminded me roadblocks in Africa. Okay. So the main difference there is that these roadblocks, they pretty much operate the same way, except it's collected toll and an area that is already feed. But what happens is that they have a monopoly. So you have a single provider, and also the government controls the number of extortionists, because you have to be hired in the police. I was wondering whether there was a, if you have to choose, because now, of course, with all these groups in Africa, in Western Africa, the extortion by police is being slowly replaced by extortion by gangs, by all these military, political opposition groups. So I'm wondering whether, in other words, having a monopoly for the police was a kind of a superior equilibrium, even though they have a monopoly, it may be a superior equilibrium because the government controls the number of extortionists. In your calculation, you say 6 million people in El Salvador, half of them probably adults, half of that male. Yeah, and you say so about 1.5 million people, and you said what, 400,000 in the.
So 70,000 actual gang members. That's both from the census the government did, and also from just like police records of the number of people they arrest. But around anywhere from 400,000 to 500,000, indirectly or directly involved as collaborators with the gang. Joining the gang is extremely difficult process.
Well, that's a third of that, right? So it's a third of the population.
Yeah.
Really large employers. So if you see this as kind of a welfare program for young men, unemployed men. Anyway, so that's what I commented. Try to put it in the broader context. And then there was a comment about what's the optimal extraction rate. Well, there's a literature on that, of course, on the Laffer curve and all that. So you should make the link with that.
Yeah, I think
there's no point killing the goose that they let go. Like, you don't want to tax it so much that they don't even come. You want to maximize your revenue.
yeah. Yeah, so I think we can definitely, I think, probably calculate the Laffer curve. In terms of like your comment about, how does this relate to government corruption, which I think like usually when people present this, people think about the open like roadblocks paper in Ghana or Benin, I believe it was.
Indonesia.
Oh, no, Indonesia. So yeah, so the thing about this, yeah, in that scenario, like, yeah, there's a pretty much essential monopoly, whereas here, like, there's more competition about like who's kind of controlling your territory, right? In terms of
free entry, that's great.
yeah. I mean, in a way, like gangs did have kind of free entry to the country because El Salvador had a brutal civil war from 1980 to 1992, and pretty much as the country was rebuilding, the gang problems kind of exacerbated due to like massive deportations from the U.S. of people affiliated with gangs, actually in California, and that's how the problem started. And the police didn't have like in the beginning didn't have like kind of the territorial reach to kind of control the kind of the proliferation of gangs in the country. There's other work that kind of looks at this. So yeah, so in a way, they kind of did have free entry in the beginning. Not so much anymore. Right now, again, more militarization of the police, more brutality, fully on repression. And again, there's little pockets of perhaps cooperation. Some people kind of think right now the current government has a under the table negotiation with gangs, which is why homicides have been able to decrease significantly.
We have a few other questions, so I'll ask next. So 2 questions. The first is, what do you think will the effects of COVID be on this kind of, I just think about all the supply chain disruptions and also the effect of different kinds of unemployment and recessions. So what would you expect to see happen? And second of all, on this hospitalization measure, there are obviously so many different things that affect hospitalization. Of course, violence in a territory can depress development in all sorts of capacities and education, et cetera. So do you actually think the mechanism is that chronic disease prices went up and hospitalizations went up, or do you think that there are other factors there, just like how?
Yeah, so let me answer the second question first. So I do think that there's definitely other factors, and like other work I'm actually looking at like how violence affects mental health and how that also might affect formal market participation and other outcomes. Right now, we're something more of this is like this is suggestive, right? Like there's an increase in pharmaceutical prices, and like it's for diseases like for drugs you actually have to be taking, right? Like you cannot go without taking insulin if you're diabetic. That you're actually seeing this. So but definitely your point, it will take in about other type stuff going on in the background. In terms of COVID, so it's actually quite interesting because Benjamin Alessi in Chicago has really interesting work about, or like tweets about what's happening in Brazil in terms of criminal governance during the pandemic, where gangs are actually the ones enforcing the quarantine. In El Salvador, there were a couple of videos that circulated that if you were out and about during like the really hard quarantine in the beginning of 2020, like they were beating people up and like forcing you to go back to your home. But aside from that, nothing too crazy. I think right now something that might be super interesting is like El Salvador is the first country to adopt Bitcoin. And the government rolled out like a virtual wallet that everyone can access to, and they gave everyone $30 to like incentivize them to like update the Bitcoin. Just another thing to discuss. That might actually, that gangs might be eating that up, but that's my hunch, not necessarily something that I can substantiate.
All right, I have Hans and then Marissa.
Yeah, I think this is really I don't want to say any like this is obviously like a very serious topic and I don't want to, and it's really exciting, interesting to study, but obviously like a very difficult topic. So I have 2 questions. One is kind of like, so it's basically about like I think principal agent problems. So you kind of talked about like how the mechanism of this like extortions work on the side of the like delivery companies and like this like security team behind it. But maybe I missed it, but you didn't really talk about like how the gangs make sure that like whoever is like actually like receiving the like extortion payment actually like passes it on to the gang. And I was wondering to what extent maybe this like this truth in 2016, but like the non-aggression pact actually like, might have had like a change in effect on that, like change the incentives of whoever like received the extortion payment, or like enable them to actually just ask for more, keep more of it to themselves. So that was my first question. The other question is kind of, I'm wondering what like the takeaway here is, like and this is probably a very annoying question, because like, you know, on one hand, this non-aggression pact, as you showed, like reduced homicides, which I think we can all agree is really good, right? But then like show all these like negative consequences, externalities. So I'm like wondering if you like what your thoughts are, what like how you can like weigh these two effects like against each other, or maybe that's just something we shouldn't engage in.
Yeah, so I think to your first question about pretty much you're asking about opportunistic extortion, and if in any context where people see that there's like a way to get easy money, you're gonna see copycats. So it's definitely opportunistic extortion that happens a lot in El Salvador. From the survey estimates I was talking about in the beginning of the presentation, I would say around like 20% of extortion incidents are around like classified as opportunistic, like not necessarily from gangs, just someone that's trying to copy them or pretend to be a gang member to get the extortion. That being said, in gang territories, the pecking order is pretty clear. Like if you betray the gang, you will show up in a body, not in a body, but like you will show up like dead the next day. So that's.
So sorry, it's just like, so does it basically mean that the gangs became richer after this non-aggression pact?
I would say like your average gang member probably did not become richer. So there's a really good New York Times article that says like these are like the poorest mafiosos in the world. They're usually living around $3 a day, but the really high ups, they're the ones really making it big, and they have motels, laundromat, everything you can think about.
1%.
Yeah, it's like the 1% of the gang members are really like the ones that are really totally well off. And also, this also trickles into politics, etc. And in terms of like, what does it take away? Yeah, I think that's like it's a hard question. And I don't think we're trying to make any statement about which one is better. We're just trying to pretty much bring to the attention that easy policies that reduce violence have all these externalities that should also be taken into account. In the long run, perhaps may make us worse off, right? But I don't think we're trying to make a value of like, reducing violence versus keeping extortion down. It's kind of like the optimal policy.
So I have one sort of theoretical question and then one just curiosity. When you argue that these an important part of your presentation was emphasizing that the extortion is backed by threats.
Mm-hmm.
During times of violence, though, are those threats during times of less violence, are those threats as credible? So why is it that you can extract more money? You think maybe the distributors could say, I know you guys aren't supposed to be killing each other right now. Yeah. You're supposed to keep the peace, so less threatened. That would be my sort of theoretical question. I mean, just the role of why do you emphasize the role of threats, but does it increase during the times of no violence? The threats?
So
threats is constant.
So we see like the threats increase. So it's arrest of individuals for threats, and we use that as a proxy for threats,
right?
Because in El Salvador, the majority of people are arrested within 48 hours of a crime being committed. Sorry.
So why do threats increase during periods of non-violence?
Oh, because like that's kind of like when you go ask for an extortion, like I'm like, did you give me $10 or
right.
Right? So like that kind of goes into like kind of like the function of like you being.
That also happened before the peace.
Right, but I think that based on like, for example, like the court document I showed you, like they're doing more kind of like very precise threats, right? Like they're finding out who your kids are. They're finding out like where you go, like for school, business, etc. Because
they have time.
Exactly, have time to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
And like we obviously can't look at this because of a lack of data from the police, but all the gatilleros who are like the sicarios in Mexican DTOs, like the shooters, the people that kill, they're freed up, right? So like they're the ones that can actually, maybe in the past, you have like perhaps like a collaborator come do the threat, but now you have a gang member that comes in and like that's more difficult.
Okay, so during the times of these periods of peace did not actually give the distributors any, sort of chance of saying that these threats aren't credible, and they still were very much afraid. Yeah. Okay, and then my just questions you could say before the end. I was curious about the role, how the gangs affect the media. In Mexico, we hear a lot about journalists being killed by the media, but from what I remember, the media freedom in El Salvador has been increasing and improving, according to, if I remember correctly. So I was curious about how the gangs interact with the media.
Yeah, so it's been increasing, then the new government took place in 2019 and collapsed again, because there's a lot of media repression out from the government.
From the government, but not-
It's quite interesting because like gangs really like talking about their exploits, and there's this investigative newspaper that we rely on for some called it Faro. They're the ones that identified the 2012 truths. That they tell pretty much they've been telling the story about gangs since the early 2000s. So I wouldn't say it's like they're targeting, maybe using them as like sources to kind of get information out and kind of scare the population.
But not killing them.
Not killing them, yeah. I don't think like, I haven't heard of like any Salvadoran like number of the media being killed recently. Like it's not in Mexico, I know it's like almost daily,
Right.
but in El Salvador not as much.
All right, we have a question from Frank online, and then we have a few more in the room. So Frank is asking, at the beginning of Bukele's term, there was an amazing picture of hundreds of gang members who were sort of summarily executed, or they were huddled in strips together. Is there any evidence that this like authoritarian method has had any effect on extortion in El Salvador, or is it all just sort of PR? You just mentioned that the government could be, you know.
Yeah, so
working.
it's like a new government took power in 2019, and they've been pretty repressive, at least in the media about saying like we're very tough on crime. This has been a strategy that's been done once, multiple times in El Salvador, over and over. So I don't think it's anything new. It's more, I think now it's just with better pictures and more LED lights. This is actually kind of like what there's like some more by Alicia Holland that looks at like the early period in the 2000s that actually kind of what led to like the strengthening of gangs in El Salvador because of the kind of like penitentiary policy, where gangs were actually housed in just MS-13 or 18th Street only prisons. And if you're housing all of them together, it's going to strengthen their structures, because actually gangs are pretty decentralized structures. They're clique-based. So it's like a clique is a neighborhood, right? And then they kind of report to like a national bigger structure. And when everyone's in prison together, it kind of distracts them. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but
That's great.
yeah.
All right, I have Nick, and then Dinsha, and then I too. So Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, just to echo what other people said, this is the amount of data you have is just incredible. It's also an extremely bleak topic. But so my question sort of builds on Rosa's question, which is like, I still don't fully understand, I think, the mechanism by which, this non-aggression pact leads to an uptick in extortion. At times you mentioned, I think, two different mechanisms. So one is this like time use mechanism, which is like, since gang members aren't spending their time killing people, they can spend more time researching their targets and then make these more credible threats and then extract higher payments. But that seems like it could exist independent of like a highly fractionalized gang context. And the motivation for you including that interaction term, it seemed, was that gangs would engage in collusion, and then the amount of extortion would go up because there would now be two payments to these gangs, right? And so I guess I want to hear a little bit more about which one of these you think is prime or like the most active. And if it's the second one, I guess I'm also then interested in like, it's a duopoly of gangs, right? So it's two gangs. And so I think two gangs is easier to coordinate. Whereas if you have 3 or 4 or 5 gangs, then the whole thing might fall apart. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on like, if there's a more fractionalized gang context that would affect the collusion thing.
Yeah, so I'm trying to answer like your first question. I think that's like a really good point. I think it's kind of like a combination of probably like perhaps both of the mechanisms. Like, yes, gangs are now freed up and like they can invest more in extortion. And also like the whole fact that like the delivery times are also increasing. So that's why hence there's a possibly more negotiation going on between the security team and kind of like with when the extortion is being handed down. So I think, yeah, I mean, for you making that negotiation, you don't necessarily need more time, right? You don't need more like information about your target, right? You pretty much have already an existing relationship. So I think it's like perhaps a combination of both. And I think like the one about more resources is perhaps more towards like the mom and pop shops that are within the territory. For this one, it's more about, the big guy like shows up and is the one that's like making the extortion.
So it's not collusion, you're saying? So there's not like there aren't two payments now. It's just one payment. It's just.
I mean, you're only making the payment in the gang territory you're going to, I mean, collusion, like one of the definitions of collusion is like you both work together, kind of like in a suit, kind of like a type of merger, but you also kind of just like collude on price, and it's more like the latter for us. Yeah. And sorry, like I forgot your second question.
Well, sort of about like the sort of scope conditions of these findings, like you describe like a duopoly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like obviously like if you have more organizations to kind of coordinate, that's going to be much more difficult. It's going to be substantiated in future iterations. And you can see that similarly like with Mexican cartels when they try to cooperate, they have so many now. Like and sometimes like even a large structure kind of breaks up because you have different fiefdoms within like the Sinaloa cartel, etc. But yeah, I think that's a point well taken. Like, this is more in a situation where you have a smaller number of gangs, yeah, or organized crime groups.
This is really interesting research. I'll echo what everyone else said. Just sort of building on that point. This seems like a very inefficient structure for extortion, collecting it at these localities rather than you're a big distributor. Why don't you just negotiate with things at the top rather than some? I'm assuming that's not happening. Other areas like Yakuza, for instance, in Japan, that's a transition to this. So we might see some of that. I'd love to hear more about that potentially. My second question has to do with trade-off on extortion versus bribery. If you've got this data, can you tell us were they paying bribes previously, were they not? You might not want to do that for this is, I guess, a comment more so. But you should probably talk to a lawyer. I'm saying that because if you did have evidence of bribery and this company had interest in the US, that's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I suspect that with extortion data, you might also be protecting a criminal. So you might want to talk to a lawyer if you have already.
Okay, awesome. So to your sorry, that just threw me off and like
Sorry,
I have to your question.
We can talk about this.
So you need to repeat the first question. Sorry, I was completely
Find out more of a.
Oh yes, okay, yeah. So that's me like kind of glossing over a little bit like how gangs, the structure of the gangs. So yes, you have MS-13, but pretty much like the gangs are operate in little fiefdoms in the neighborhood, right? It's like the cliques, like the cliques, right? So like you have like the Hollywood local salvatruchos that have like kind of like a connection to Hollywood because the kind of leaders were deported from operating in the Hollywood area, Fulton, local salvatruchos. So and it's pretty much just that clique. And like going outside of your territory is extremely dangerous for gang members. One, because the police is going to easily ID you because usually you have tattoos all over your body. And two, you're going to be a target for the rival gang.
But why wouldn't you just negotiate directly with that kid for like a regular rather than one-time payments?
So that's what happens usually with mom and pop shops, right? Like you're going to pay me $10 every week for the rest of the year. But for these delivery trucks, the kind of like the function is a bit different, right? Because you always have the exit option. Like the company can just say, oh, we don't want to deliver anymore to this territory.
All right, I do.
And sorry, you have another question. I forgot.
Extortion versus bribery.
We'll skip that because it's lawyer.
So the important aspect, it was very fascinating research, and it's like literally deserves the term fascinating. We were all very much fascinating as you see. But like this threat mechanism to be more convincing, I think you should tell us a little bit more about the organization of the gangs.
Mm-hmm.
And like how they and like I was thinking that we cannot say much about this because it's very difficult to study, but at the end actually you told like how decentralized they are, and like if you can say more about like why they were now able to spend more time, like what is the inter-organizational structure of these small victims of gangs, that I think that would make the threat theory more convincing. My question is about more like the implications, like what do you predict about the future? Because it looks like there's a cycle going on, right? So when there's peace, there are more resources, and therefore they are making this peace. But when there are more resources, actually, with time they are going to compete more. Yeah. And so it's like, do you foresee more like this cycle to go in the foreseeable future?
Yeah. So I think El Salvador is kind of like this. Politics of like, or kind of like incidents of perpetual violence. It's just like cycles of like high violence and then you have peace. when kind of pretty much both sides kind of get tired of competing and kind of want to re-energize. Do I see like a way, do you see like a way out of this? I mean, I don't know, because like the government keeps reacting the same way as they do before, and that just kind of strengthens the games, right? Like, usually like.
It's very well timed.
When you like, there was like a spike in violence in the past 2 days in El Salvador, where you were having like 10 to 20 daily homicides, and the government's response was like, let's send out the troops. So the thing is like, let's stop and frisk every male. I didn't stop them first once, and like it's not. I mean, they treat you like, you know, like you're low, like, so it's not like a pleasant experience, and like that might create animosity towards like the police, and like it might send you into kind of like a spiral of like, yeah, the gang is kind of like the option. Obviously not for me, I'm not a gang member. But yeah, it's a very, very difficult, if I had answers to that question, I would run for president, and like, yeah, but no.
I mean, in 10 years, 20 years later.
Right, Nishan?
Carlos, thank you very much for sharing your really fascinating research with us. I was very engaged and very entertained up until the moment when Dinsha mentioned lawyers. My question is that sort of to follow up on some of the previous comments, could you talk a little bit more about the political context in which this non-aggression pact emerged? Because it sounds to me like from little bits and pieces of information that you shared through the presentation and the Q&A that, you know, this view that the government is just incompetent or unable to tackle this issue, it doesn't seem to be quite accurate. It sounds to me like you keep mentioning these this notion that the government or the political elites might have an incentive in sustaining that arrangement, maybe molding it in such a way where it's not too costly, doesn't result in a lot of homicides. You also mentioned that there sounds to me like there's a political economy around the whole notion of security and anti-gang security. So it sounds to me that there are a lot more beneficiaries from this than just the gangs themselves. So how does this play into our understanding of the persistence of that phenomenon? What really is at stake when we're talking about the persistence of persistence or the remolding or the upgrading,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like that's a super fascinating question. And I think, sorry if I can imply this. I don't think necessarily the police is ineffective. I think, I interact with so many police officers, and they're out there every single day, like, trying to like do their best with the limited resources they have. The police is definitely underfunded. It's more about like the decisions the leadership takes, trying to take the shortcuts to kind of address public security. Like you can imagine a situation like, for example, the 2012 pact where the government was actually involved. It was not in a transparent process, right? It was all under the table, and of course, when it came up to light, all the public opinion turned against it, right? And like people were really angry this was going on. So that immediately kind of like ended that kind of like first drop in violence. The second drop we see with the non-aggression pact is more about gangs kind of deciding, you know what, maybe why kill each other? Like we're gonna just like, kind of create our own little few stones and kind of just, extract as much as we can. There's definitely like, this affects all sides of the economy. Like there are more private security officers than police officers in the country. So that's like, the industry that really thrives because of this as well. The informal economies in a lot of like the neighborhoods where gangs operate benefit a lot from their delinquency. Like, El Salvador is very common. If you're driving a car, they steal your rims or like parts of the car. You see that in like a shop right around the corner where it actually happens. So like, people benefit as well from this. So it's very, it's kind of similar to the righteous question. It's a difficult question, and it's something that's kind of pretty much embedded all throughout Salvadoran society. And it's not necessarily super easy to answer. There's also like politicians, mayors that have been implicated with gangs in the past. And of course, in 2014, 2015, like the presidential candidates both met with gang representatives to kind of like try to get them to support them in the elections, to kind of get people in their neighborhoods to go vote for them. So it's pretty much touched all aspects of society. It's very difficult.
So unless I'm wrong, we have Marcel and then, so Marcel?
Yes, I wanted to revisit the issue of competition. I think you need to work on that one because, I mean, if you have a cartel, if a duopoly and then they're selling a service. So in this particular case, the reason why they can raise the price when they create a cartel is because they can increase the price to the consumer. But it's here the consumer is not really demanding the service. So I was thinking, could they actually? So the way I understand the deal is that they basically stop fighting over territory. That's fine. That doesn't by itself create anything because they just have the same territory.
Yeah.
So it's only if the transportation or the distribution system can say, okay, fine, this is there are two areas here that compete. I'm trying to reach customers in this particular area. There's one shopping mall here, one shopping mall here. This is, what is it, M13,
Yeah.
what is Barrio? Well, now I have competition because I could deliver this one or this one. So in that case, you can see that by them saying, okay, well, let me collude, this is the price, and the same price on both sides, then you cannot go beyond, you cannot obviate their extortion because they're not competing to attract customers, to attract more deliveries to their territories. So that I was really trying to see where are they competing? That you are saying that you want to reduce competition. I mean, I'm increasing extortion. I mean, that means that you might want to geographically visit an area where they are in contact, and they basically choose which route or whatever. So that's something that gives you an identification. The other point, a very quick point, if I'm allowed to. So that's right when we were discussing here, why is this existing? I'm thinking that this is it's a massive warfare, it's a massive transfer system. You just said it yourself. So we know, I don't know when Arena was in power, it's not exactly a welfare-friendly government. So I'm just thinking that maybe this evolved as a way of a redistributive system for a lot of poorly educated youth.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of could we develop a welfare system that replaces it? Politically, it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the point about competition is pretty well taken, and the distribution company have really fine-grained like territories and like exact locations where like the gangs operate. Unfortunately, they weren't willing to share that because it's actually we've seen the ones for the police and like their systems are 10 times better. Like the private sector has 10 times better. I mean, here's the bottom line. They really mapped out all the gangs. But right now, like, we're trying to do the best with the data, they're graciously share with us. But I do agree, like, we can talk a little bit more about, what exactly is like the where they're competing, et cetera. The welfare kind of like implications of this. Yeah, I mean, I definitely see like I was talking about earlier. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And, a lot of the policies that the government does try to implement to kind of like get youth away from gangs might end up in the wrong hands. Et cetera. So we have some work coming out that's trying to look at kind of like schooling policies and whether I don't know if you guys are familiar with RATE in the US, like El Salvador has implemented similar programs and around this period. So we're trying to look at whether like that kind of dissuades individuals from joining gangs and also whether that also affects them. I talked to like some ex-gang members, people that are exited the gangs. And that's like a whole another topic. It's pretty difficult to leave a gang. It's a commitment for life. They usually, if you're older and you're evangelical, they allow you to leave it. And I interviewed two ex-gang members that now work at a factory that usually makes actually all the apparel for universities in the US. Actually, one of the things they do is like they hire a lot of ex-gang members. They told me like, when I was in a gang member, like my fridge was always full. Now I only have, like the burn necessities, right? And these were mid to like high ranking gang members. So, that is also important. Yes.
All right. Oh, no, just final question in the back.
Okay, so you talked about a couple of peace agreements and like kind of ceasefires between the gangs. I was wondering what enforcement mechanism there is to like ensure that at least like the two major gangs like continue to abide by that peace agreement.
Yeah, so like in the 2012 truce, the government gave them a lot of kickbacks in prison, so they transferred a lot of like the higher ranking gang members from maximum security prisons to like less secure prisons.
Okay.
Where they were able to kind of better coordinate their kind of lower ranking gang members. So usually that's usually what's usually involved, right? Like you make the really high leaders like everyone respects, kind of like be able to better communicate to the lower level gang members.
Okay,
Yeah.
and how about for the peace agreement that was brokered between the gangs themselves without the involvement of the
Yeah,
government?
so that also was like the high ranking gang members were also like pretty involved. There was also, like the church had kept a lot of the kind of negotiating channels from the truce open. And that's how kind of like 2012, the 2016 truce kind of came about. So the church was kind of like behind it, not necessarily as a main actor, but kind of, I mean, like brought people to the table at least.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, just, thank you so much, Carlos. This is a really great presentation.
Thank you.
The church.
How did you get, yeah, the church is not surprising, but how did you get this?
I was really persistent.
Really, really,